Welcome everyone to a stealth webinar on the topic of reimagining the assessment process, where we're going to be focusing specifically on the Loonz app and virtual reality. My name is Michelle Lang. I'm an occupational therapist and I perform educational courses such as this for stealth products. So this is what we'll be covering during this session. We're going to be discussing the problem that we have when we're doing power wheelchair evaluations and trainings. There's some limitations there that can be remediated by use of some of these cutting-edge solutions, such as apps like Loonz and virtual reality. Now, a few things to keep in mind. We ultimately want someone to be successful in their use of a power wheelchair. And so in addition to other things we'll be discussing with evaluation and training, it's important to remember that the client needs to be optimally positioned. That's easy to say, sometimes not so easy to accomplish, but really, really important to make sure this person has optimal stability and posture to be as functional as possible so they can be truly successful with the task, or at least show you their potential. From a motor standpoint, we need to determine the optimal driving method. That's another important piece of our assessment process. And from a cognitive standpoint, does this person have the mobility concepts in order to successfully use a power wheelchair? And if they do not, is this something we can build in with some training? And then finally, once someone does receive a power mobility base, it's important to provide mobility training to optimize their skills so that our ultimate goal of successful mobility is achieved. Because our goal isn't to recommend and receive funding for a power wheelchair or to get a power wheelchair in candy red frame. We want to make sure the client is successful in their mobility. Now, many people who use a power wheelchair are going to need an alternative driving method, and we can use some of these assessment and training strategies for these clients as well. So we know that the chair pictured here has a rather standard joystick, and then we have other analog, also called proportional driving methods, and digital or non-proportional driving methods. So proportional is going to include those standard joysticks, compact joysticks, which are smaller but require the same amount of force and distance to activate. Mini proportional joysticks, which require less travel and much less force than a standard or compact joystick to activate, work well for people with muscle weakness. A touch pad, Magitech, and a newer driving method called gyro set. All of these are proportional driving methods, meaning that I have full 360-degree directional control and speed control. The further I move from center, the faster the base will go. That's as long as I have the motor controls to actually make that happen. Then we have a whole slew of non-proportional driving methods, also called digital, and these are comprised of switches. So we may be using a preset switch array, such as the head array, proximity arrays that pictured here at the top, perhaps inside a tray, fiber optic arrays, or sip and puff. We can also combine individual switches. There's a lot of technologies out there, including iDrive, that let us combine mechanical and electrical switches now as well to best meet someone's needs. And then single switch scanning as a rather last resort option if we can really truly only find one switch site on this person's body. And finally, eye gaze. So traditional mobility assessment and training has been around for a while. That's why it's called traditional. And there's some advantages to it. It has a strong track record. This is something that we've been using for a long period of time and hopefully with some decent success. Because we've been using this for a while, it's also familiar. So for those of us who have been doing this for a long time, I'm very comfortable with more traditional strategies of assessing and training someone to use a power wheelchair. But there are some drawbacks. First of all is space requirements. I used to work in a clinic a while ago at Children's Hospital in the Denver area. We had a large space lined with equipment on the sides. We had lots and lots of different power chairs, lots of seating options, lots of driving methods, and it all took up a tremendous amount of space. We needed a lot of space in the middle of the room for somebody to try to drive a power wheelchair, either during an assessment or as we were training someone to better optimize their skills. Not everyone has availability of large spaces, or those spaces might be used already. So for example, most schools have a large gymnasium or cafeteria, but large crowded schools are using that space almost the entire day for one purpose or another, and so it's not readily available for us when we decide we need to do an evaluation or training. There's also safety concerns with our more traditional assessment and training strategies. We can certainly experience collisions. So no matter how careful I am, that potential power wheelchair driver could run into the wall, run into other objects, even run into people as I'm doing assessment and training. That could lead to equipment damage, property damage, and more importantly, injuries. There are some facilities that are very, very concerned, as they should be, about this and are concerned about liability. And so it's important that we keep this in mind and perhaps explore options that increase the safety issues. Then we have the trainer. A certain level of competency is required if I'm going to be evaluating or, more importantly, training someone to use a power wheelchair. I have to be aware of these potential hazards. I want to make sure that I'm not putting the client or others in jeopardy. And if I don't do a good job of that, again, liability can be an issue. Some of these emerging technologies, such as apps and virtual reality, allow someone who maybe doesn't have the same level of competency to do training with someone because it removes some of these safety concerns. And we'll discuss that in more detail here in just a moment. Now, some of these options are also going to vary whether we're working with children or adults. Kids, again, in relation to power mobility assessment and training, tend to do best with very limited verbal instruction, as opposed to adults who usually are going to prefer clear instructions, clear expectations for the task. Kids learn best with trial and error. Let me just drive around that big gym and play around, and I'm going to learn from my mistakes, learn from perhaps moving in a direction that I didn't want to. Where adults generally do better with a task-oriented training. Drive to that location. Go do this. Bring this to that person. With kids, it's very important to minimize distractions. Now, that can be important for adults too, but children generally are more distractible than adults. We want to tone that down, and we often need to really break down the task in order for this child to be successful ultimately with power mobility. Whereas adults, while they may need the task broken down, it's really important that the adult can see their progress, can see that they have mastered a certain aspect of this task and are ready to move on to the next portion. So we have some new tools that are available for us to use in power mobility assessments and training, and that includes apps and virtual reality. Kids will often do well with these apps. It doesn't mean there aren't adults who could use them as well, but in general, kids are often going to do quite well with these. And Stealth, as you're aware, has the Loonz app and has had this for a few years now. So let's take a closer look at how this can be used to address some of these power mobility assessment and training limitations. Now, in the past, long time ago, when computer monitors looked like a box, computer programs were sometimes used with a joystick, kind of an Atari-style joystick that fit into those computers, to assess and train mobility skills. Basically, someone would follow a little maze around the screen, kind of like playing a Pac-Man game. However, research and experience demonstrated that there wasn't very much carryover between playing around with these computer programs and the real task of driving in the environment. However, those programs could help to train motor skills, the actual task of using that joystick. We now have some apps available that allow that iDrive driving method to control an application, Loonz, on a tablet. The goals are to use this as a mobility assessment tool, particularly of the driving method itself. Since we can use this with a variety of driving methods, it gives us a fun way, a safe way, a way without a lot of space to start narrowing down, do I think this is an appropriate driving method for this individual? It also can serve as a mobility training tool. So if we're trying to improve skills, that's what this is also designed for, but particularly of the driving method itself, more that motor task rather than the cognitive mobility concepts portion of the task. And along the way, this app can provide entertainment. That's great. Recreation. Many of our clients really don't have the ability to participate in recreational tasks. And socialization. I can play with someone else. So what are the advantages of using this app? Well, the client can remain in their own seating system. That's huge. Another big limitation of power mobility assessments is that we're often taking someone out of their very customized seating system and throwing them into a power chair that wasn't designed for them. And so they may lack the postural support they need in order to show you what they can really do. So a power wheelchair itself and actual movement of the chair is not required. A battery pack can run the driving method if someone is in a manual chair. And if they are in a power chair, the power chair doesn't have to be in driving mode. They can simply use the driving method to interact with the app. So we now have decreased safety concerns because the client isn't moving through the environment where they might run into obstacles or other people. Many families already have a tablet, and it can also be connected to a TV through the tablet, and that allows a bigger view. But again, these are things that people tend to have at home, and that really helps from a cost standpoint. But there are some drawbacks to apps as well. This is only one tool in our toolbox, and it is important to make sure that we are not limiting our assessment and training to only use of this app. It's still unclear how much carryover is going to occur to the actual task of driving a power chair for people who have the opportunity to use Loonz. We need research on that. And again, it's important to use other assessment and training strategies. So this is Miles. He's in a little evaluation chair. We've been able to move over his seat, and we actually have switches hooked up. We were able to use these switches to control other tasks for a while to determine where we thought he could control switches for power wheelchair driving. But before ordering him a chair, certainly I wanted to do far more than just play around with an app like Loonz. I wanted to actually get him into a power chair, demonstrate that he was ready before actually ordering something. So again, Loonz is an app that allows the client to play games through the driving method. As long as it's an iDrive driving method, you can connect the iDrive 4. Since it has Bluetooth, you can connect this wirelessly to an iPad. You could to a phone as well. It's just a pretty small screen. And if somebody is not using this on their power chair, you can use a portable rechargeable battery pack. I do this often, and it is a very simple thing to just plug this in and get it all charged up before I see a client. So we're going to watch a video of Loonz in action. And that's a great video of Pierce interacting with this app in his manual wheelchair and playing alongside his dad. Again, one of the nice things about putting anything on a shiny tablet is siblings, friends, parents, other people are going to want to come alongside you more likely. And since this is so engaging, there's a good chance that he is practicing some of these skills a lot more than he would if we couch that in some other type of home program. So that's a little bit about using apps to help facilitate, to help be a portion of power mobility assessments and training, particularly with children, though again, fun for adults as well. Next, we're going to turn over to virtual reality, which is a brand new tool available from Stealth and changing even as we speak. There's continued advances to this technology. So many adults may learn best using virtual reality, VR, though a lot of kids and teens are going to benefit as well, maybe tolerate it better than us adults. It's now commercially available through Stealth, and this is a big deal. VR has been used in research labs actually for quite a long time, but we haven't had a commercial option, and now we do. So it's important that we start with some definitions, not to bore you, but to make sure that we're all able to explain this well to people who ask us questions about it. So just what is VR? Well, it's a realistic three-dimensional image or artificial environment. It's created with a mixture of hardware and software. So software that's running on your computer, hardware such as the VR goggles. It's presented to the user in a way that it is accepted as a real environment. So if you've ever been in a theater, perhaps like an IMAX theater, the film might make you feel like you're moving with it. And it's because the size of the screen is so large, it takes up your entire visual field. You add on to that something like soaring, if you've ever been on that ride at Disney World. It's an awesome ride. And soaring, well, it's at Disneyland too. It combines a very large screen with movement. So your mind is tricked even further and you begin to feel as if you're really there. That's a key part of VR. And then on top of that, I can interact with this environment, whereas I can't do that if I'm in an IMAX theater, for example. Some more definitions. Well, real world seems fairly straightforward, but the real world is what we experience throughout our day. Even though our lives are becoming more virtual all the time, and at the time of this recording, we're highly virtual because of a virus that's going around. So we're doing things online, but we live in a real world. The virtual world is a synthetic environment that's computer generated, and it's not limited by the laws of physics. So in the virtual world, I can fly where I can't do that in the real world. It can be viewed on a monitor or through those goggles, also known as a head-mounted display. It's going to be more immersive when I'm wearing the head-mounted display, as I can't see anything else except that artificial environment. Now, there are some virtual environments that are non-immersive, mixed, and fully immersive, and that's what we're talking about today with virtual reality. But non-immersive would include video games. So if I'm playing a video game, I'm in a pretend virtual environment. I might be able to do all sorts of things that I can't do in the real world, but I know that it's not real. It's fairly two-dimensional. Typically, I can see my environment around it, so it's not immersive. Wii games, robotics, all those are in the non-immersive category of virtual environments. In the mixed category are a couple things called augmented reality and augmented virtuality. So under augmented reality, there are digital images that are placed on top of real images. So if you look at the picture here, this is augmented virtuality, where there's images of the real world placed within a virtual environment. So here's a picture of a young man who is very real, but he is appearing to be a part of a virtual environment. And there's some examples here of various technologies that use this. Now, please know that I am far too old to be a video game player, and I really don't know how any of these work. I don't play video games. My children do. But what we're talking about today is truly immersive. That's virtual reality. The reason these definitions are important is someone may mention some of these technologies, but they are not an immersive virtual environment. Now, there's a lack of standardized terminology in this emerging field, and so it's really important that we're clear about what type of technology is actually being used. Now, current systems typically use some type of VR headset, and that display may include gyroscopes and motion sensors, and these track what the head is doing, so that as the person is moving their head, like say to the left side, I am now looking towards that portion of the virtual environment. So there's a direct connection between what my body's doing and what's happening in this virtual environment. In this picture, someone's also holding something in their hands. So depending on what they're doing with their hands, they're directly impacting what's happening in the virtual environment. In the stealth virtual reality system, what's perhaps held in the hand would be, say, a joystick. Wherever that driving method is activated, directly interacts with the environment as well. It's a stereoscopic display. That's important because it tricks your mind into believing this is a real environment, that you are in it, and a very powerful processor. Now, virtual reality started back in the 1970s, and it started in medicine, flight simulation, and automobile design. Another area where there's quite a bit of virtual reality is in military training. So this started to allow people to practice skills that were otherwise difficult to practice. So imagine in medicine, for example, and virtual reality is still a large part of this. Let's say there's a medical student who's learning how to remove someone's appendix. It's certainly safer to have them remove someone's virtual appendix at least a few times before they try it on a real person, or even a cadaver, because they might run out of cadavers as well. So it's more practical. You have unlimited practice sessions that can occur for this person, and sometimes you can readily change the parameters. So with flight simulation, this allows someone obviously to practice without the chance of damaging or injuring people, a very large aircraft, and it allows you to change the scenarios. So now I'm flying under different circumstances. So this is where a lot of virtual reality began. By the 1990s, there were consumer headsets available for purchase that were primarily used for gaming. By 2016, just a few years ago, there were over 200 companies that were developing virtual reality products, and the applications are expanding all the time. So here are more recreational activities. You can see on the right, well, you can find these even in your local mall or amusement park where you pay a small fee, you go inside, and there's a combination of movement of a quote vehicle that you are in, and then the visual environment that you see through this headset. What about virtual reality in healthcare? Well, VR is being used in hospital settings primarily to help people who are experiencing pain or anxiety. And it's being used as a distractor, as something to kind of trick the brain to focus on something else for a while rather than pain and anxiety, but certainly has other applications. I really like this quote from the CEO of VR Health. Virtual reality has the power to ease the pain of chemotherapy treatment, create a seamless environment for physical therapy exercises, and train children with ADHD to focus their attention. So there's a lot of potential applications. Again, this is a relatively emerging area of technology, and so there's a lot more research that could be done. Virtual reality is being used for stroke rehabilitation. Now, we've heard about constraint-induced therapy, or you may have, where the unaffected arm, for example, might be restrained somehow, sometimes even in a cast, to force someone to use the impacted limb to improve function. Well, this is a twist on that, where instead we're using virtual reality, where this gentleman here has a controller in each of his hands, and he has to use those hands together during this task. He's well distracted by the demands of the task, and that might help him to better start using that affected extremity. Also, since VR doesn't require the same level of expertise as having a trained clinician present during a therapy session, this is something that this gentleman might be able to use additional times during the day with someone with less training, because there's really very little risk to him. So the most clinical evidence we have about the validity of VR right now is in dealing with people who have pain and anxiety, and also people who are suffering from PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Much of the VR research has been based on non-immersive environments. And remember, virtual reality is a fully immersive environment. So a lot of the research that says it's in regards to virtual reality actually is in regards to the Xbox Connect or Wii, and these are non-immersive. The groups in these research studies have been rather small and rather heterogeneous, meaning that we have a variety of different ages, diagnoses, and so it's a little harder to draw conclusions in these studies. There's also been a lack of consistent interventions that were used in the subjects of these studies. So certainly more research is required. So what's the bottom line? Well, it's not clear which characteristics of virtual reality are most helpful yet in rehab. The goal is always more important than the tool. So maybe our goal is to help that gentleman with a stroke use his affected extremity with more control. That goal is always important. This is maybe just one tool that can be used, again, as an adjunct to assessment and therapy. But there are expanding applications of VR, and that includes the use of VR in power wheelchair assessment and training. So who may be able to benefit from use of VR? Well, someone who has never had mobility experiences, or someone who has lost their mobility, so perhaps has an acquired injury. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had some early games, computer programs and joysticks that were an attempt to assess and train power wheelchair readiness. But the research at the time showed that this rather two-dimensional activity did not translate over well to actual wheelchair driving. But there has been research on VR and use with power mobility for a number of years. It's just that we have only recently had a commercial option available to us. Research has shown that power wheelchair performance in the virtual environment was representative of driving ability in the real environment, meaning that we can actually use this as a portion of our power mobility assessment and training. We do see that carryover to the actual task. And I believe it is because virtual reality is such a multi-sensory experience, as is driving a power wheelchair. So virtual reality during the assessment process can be really helpful. It can help us manage our time, because now I may have more time under the supervision of other people to allow my client to continue to practice these skills. The VR system that Stealth has tracks the results of each session, so I can look at those to help supplement my documentation. The environment is a controlled one. I don't have to worry about this person actually moving through a physical environment yet, so I don't have those safety concerns. And again, we have nearly unlimited practice time. So again, in a typical power wheelchair assessment, we have to have access to a powered chair that supports a client's positioning needs and positioning of the access method and the type of access method as well. We need a large area to house all that equipment and to trial the power wheelchair. And if we're going outside like we were this day, well, we better hope it's a sunny day. Jonathan's wearing a coat for a reason here. It's a sunny Colorado day, but it is cold outside. So weather doesn't always cooperate with us if we have to go outdoors. Whereas with virtual reality, the client can again remain in their current base and seating system. We don't have the same physical space requirements, and the driving method can be attached even to a manual wheelchair. When we're doing power wheelchair training, this is Faith, and she's recently received her chair, we could be limited by space as well, environmental access, and providing adequate supervision. We had to find a nice wide hallway that had a lack of people in it, just us, so that she could practice using her new chair. Whereas with virtual reality, we could begin in a virtual introductory setting like a gymnasium and then move through various environments of increasing complexity. And that can provide very frequent practice opportunities, even with less supervision. So I would feel comfortable doing a training session with Faith in her school to make sure she's not going to get into trouble. But I may not feel as comfortable with someone else training her. Whereas if they were using a virtual reality system, my comfort level would be different. Now for the best impact, we're probably going to combine virtual reality and traditional approaches. With an assessment, the client should be given the opportunity to drive an actual power wheelchair in a real environment with the appropriate postural support, with the appropriate driving method, before we make a final recommendation for a power chair. This is really important. So VR can help us quite a bit with this, but we do need to actually try before we buy, before we write that letter of medical necessity. For training, if we combine VR and traditional mobility training strategies, that can enhance our results. We can move someone through a progression of skills more readily, and we're providing a multi-modality approach. Some things to be aware of. When we are within this virtual environment, it is a cognitive and physiologic immersion. And that is a very unique situation. It's something you kind of have to try if you haven't already to fully appreciate it. But it really does somewhat trick your mind, and your brain will respond to this virtual environment. Now, for some people who are experiencing pain, this can lead to a reduction in pain, which is fantastic. Some older patients and older clinicians and suppliers as well will have a difficult time adjusting to perhaps these new technologies. I find that sometimes an older adult is more likely to experience issues like motion sickness, for example. Uh, Also, we might find there's just some reluctance to use such a new technology. It might feel a little scary. And so it's important that as providers, we introduce this in a manner that is more likely to be accepted. So what's the future of VR in complex rehab? Well, as the technology continues to advance, hopefully clients, caregivers, other team members are going to be more open to use of VR and even embrace this technology as it becomes more and more common. Right now, it's very, very new, and you might run into some reluctance or intimidation initially. All right, so enough about all that talk. I know you want to get to how does this work? Well, we know that until very recently, VR for power wheelchair assessment and training has only been available in research labs, but it is now available through Stealth. You might have had a chance to try this already. If you haven't, I would definitely encourage you to do so, to arrange that through Stealth. But here's some general tips. It's important to allow time for the user to accommodate to this task to reduce motion sickness. The first time I tried this, I definitely felt a little queasy. I tend to get some motion sickness in motor vehicles, and I was definitely feeling that. So what we found is if you put the goggles on a client and you ask them not to move their head for about a minute or two, just let them kind of get used to being in this virtual environment, that can help that accommodation to reduce motion sickness. If the user cannot tolerate the goggles, and it might be that they still are having some motion sickness, you can take them off and have the client only look at the screen. This still provides a sense of movement because there's a direct response on the screen to what the client is doing. It's really fairly immersive, but it's not as intense. This also might be for a client who physically just cannot tolerate the goggles. Now, there's some unique features to this Stealth system. There are 3 levels: a gymnasium, an outdoor path, and the inside of a home. And the client will move through levels within each of these virtual environments. As the client moves through a more advanced or higher level within an environment, there are more distractions that are added to that virtual environment because that's reality, and we want people to accommodate to those distractions, driving with those. VR could be used to maintain or even increase skills while waiting for power wheelchair funding approval. So let's say I've just seen a client. I think they're ready for a power chair. We've recommended one. They may not get that for 3 to 6 months, depending on the funding source. And during that time, most clients aren't going to touch a power wheelchair. Well, I hate to see my client not gain any progress during that time and perhaps even lose some. If I could use virtual reality, they can continue to work on these skills so that when their power wheelchair comes, they're that much more ready to use it. There are updates that are provided through remote software downloads. So as any update occurs to the software portion of the VR, those will automatically be received. And there is data tracking within this software, and it's based on the wheelchair skills test, which is a very well-recognized outcomes test. And it's a great way of tracking how your client is progressing with the tasks that are presented within the environment. You could even record a session and you can play it back later to analyze how the client is doing. So if this client is spending time perhaps working on these skills without you being directly present, you can go back, look at the data, or even watch an actual recorded session. Now you probably recognize Gabe here. We're going to go ahead and watch a video of Gabe discussing the virtual driving simulator, and there's even a little cameo in here by myself. And if you need more information about iDrive, there is a web page dedicated just to that that will send you regular updates as well. So that brings us towards the end of this recording. If you do have questions, since we can't take that in a recorded format, I would encourage you to contact myself, and my contact information will be here in just a moment, or Stealth, with any questions that you have about this technology and its applications. And if you haven't had a chance to give this a try, I would encourage you to do so. If you're a little nervous about it, you can try it with the screen at first. It's really the best way to learn how this works and to be prepared to show others and be able to answer their questions. The VR kit does come with a manual, including some quick start guidelines, just step by step, so that you can get this running fairly readily. I want to thank you very much for your attention during this recording. I do hope it was helpful to you. and make sure that you have my contact information. Thanks everyone for joining us today.